In the summer of 1791, in one of England's most dynamic towns, ideas collided with fear and violence carved itself into stone and paper. Birmingham, a city of industrious workshops and fervent minds, became the stage for a crisis that would expose the fragile seams of British society. The events of July that year were not merely an outburst of local animus. They were the eruption of anxieties triggered by revolution abroad, intensified by religious dissent at home, and accelerated by the combustible mixture of rumour and outrage. This is the story of the Birmingham Riots of 1791. The people who lived them, the debates they provoked, the voices that were silenced or scattered, and the contested memory that remained. By the late 18th century, Birmingham had ceased to be merely a market town. It had become an engine of innovation. Small workshops clustered into manufactories, and craftsmen who once toiled for local patrons found themselves part of a wider network of trade, supply, and invention. This was also a town where religious dissenters, those who rejected the Church of England's exclusive authority, flourished. They were artisans, merchants, scientists, and ministers. Their gatherings sustained a culture of inquiry that valued experiment, reason, and debate. At the heart of Birmingham's intellectual life stood the Lunar Society, a loose coalition of farmers of knowledge, metallurgists, instrument makers, natural philosophers, and manufacturers who met under the light of the full moon to discuss experiments and ideas. In that circle, notable figures such as Matthew Boulton, James Watt, Erasmus Darwin, and Joseph Priestley exchanged thoughts on chemistry, mechanics, and society. Joseph Priestley was, by disposition and accomplishment, a paradox. He was a scientist of international repute. His experiments expanded the boundaries of chemistry. He was a minister and a theologian, but his religious convictions placed him among the most controversial dissenting voices. He argued for toleration, for freedom of conscience, and he occasionally allied his theological dissent with political reform. To supporters, he was a prophet of progress. To opponents, he was a dangerous radical whose sympathy for events across the Channel suggested disloyalty to crown and altar. The wider context of Europe sharpened every local dispute. In 1789, Paris had convulsed. The fall of the Bastille, the Declaration of Rights, the radical reordering of French politics terrified conservative observers across Britain. For some, the revolution was a vindication of humanity's capacity for self-government. For many others, it was a vision of social disorder and sacrilege. Newspapers, pamphlets, sermons, and private letters propelled the argument into the kitchens, workshops, and chapels. Birmingham's dissenters, for their part, interpreted many French actions as an extension of the principles they prized: liberty of conscience, legal equality, and the reform of corrupt institutions. That interpretative gap would become the fault line across which violence would travel. On the evening of the 14th of July, 1791, a group of reformers gathered at the Royal Hotel in Birmingham to mark the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. They called it a dinner of commemoration. For many attendees, the Bastille represented the overthrow of arbitrary power. For others, it was an ignoble symbol of mob violence. Word reached outside. Rumour carries faster than fact in towns. A crowd assembled at the hotel. Eyewitness reports afterward vary in detail but agree in tone. The gathering, seen by some as seditious, inflamed the passions of neighbouring Loyalists. A confrontation erupted. The hotel's windows were broken and, in the heated atmosphere, violence accelerated. The Bastille dinner was the immediate provocation, though not the full cause. In the days that followed, the mood hardened. Meetings took place in taverns and on street corners. A social geography of suspicion emerged. Neighbour against neighbour, employer against artisan, Anglican against dissenter. The lines were not exclusive. Many tradesmen were themselves dissenters. Many who supported the Church of England counted among the commercial elite. Yet, in the fever of those weeks, identities compressed into us and them. As the night wore on, assaults began on buildings associated with dissent and reform. The attackers moved through the town in a pattern that would become painfully clear. Targeted, systematic, and punctuated by a deliberate sense of retribution. Between July 14th and July 17th, the violence escalated into what contemporaries later called riots, though riot understates the organized nature of many attacks. Buildings were burned, libraries destroyed, churches and meeting houses assaulted, and private properties looted. The violence unfolded in waves, each day bringing new destruction. The first night saw the Royal Hotel attacked, and many guests forced to flee. But the rioters' fury did not stop with the hotel's windows. In the dark, they turned toward the dissenting houses and meeting places. The new meeting house, where Joseph Priestley and others had preached, was singled out. Contemporary accounts later described mobs who forced entry and destroyed interior furnishings. Books were dragged into the street and set alight. The mob then moved to other chapels, Baptist meeting houses, Unitarian chapels, smashing, burning, and demolishing. Among the properties attacked was the home of Dr. Priestley. His library and laboratory, repositories of manuscripts, correspondence, and experimental apparatus, were destroyed. For a man whose work depended upon accumulation of knowledge and careful experimentation, the loss was incalculable. Priestley managed to escape with some friends to safety. He later described the destruction with a mixture of sorrow and political analysis. To him, it was not merely private loss, but a violent statement against toleration and intellectual freedom. The third day brought looting and more selective attacks. The rioters did not confine themselves to public buildings. They entered private houses. Wealthy reformers found furniture and valuables taken. Some rioters, emboldened by the absence or passivity of civil authorities, paraded trophies of their destruction through the streets. Complaints later lodged with magistrates, and in the press, accused local officials of either failing to deploy forces or doing so deliberately slowly. Some local leaders, sympathetic to Loyalist causes, were unwilling to risk firing upon fellow citizens. Others feared that intervention might escalate killings. The result was a patchwork of responses that often left those under attack to fend for themselves. By the fourth night, the worst of the attacks had subsided, but the physical and moral toll was enormous. Chapels lay in ruins, houses had been gutted, and collections of books and instruments vital to the intellectual life of the town had been destroyed. Many who had been targeted fled, some to nearby towns, others to different countries. Casualties in terms of lives were not as numerous as the material losses. Yet the destruction of cultural capital, books, scientific instruments, and manuscripts represented a different kind of violence, one aimed at the capacity to think, record, and transmit knowledge. To recover the shape of what happened, historians rely upon a patchwork of contemporary sources, newspapers, private letters, sermons, legal depositions, and personal memoirs. These fragments offer different perspectives. Some defend the rioters as defenders of the church. Others portray them as thugs, or even as agents of a coordinated elite who desired to silence dissent. The truth is complicated and often contradictory. The voices of ordinary participants are sometimes difficult to recover with certainty, but their presence in the archival record is unmistakable. Tavern keepers, iron workers, and labourers appear in depositions and in petitions to magistrates. Some confess participation, others later recanted, pleading coercion or ignorance. The lines between voluntary zeal and coercive mob pressure blurred in the moment. While intellectuals such as Priestley lamented the loss of books and apparatus, working people spoke privately of economic anxieties, local grievances, and the fear stirred by revolutionary rumour. In assembling these testimonies, the historian must weigh context, motive, and the likelihood of exaggeration or self-justification. But the diversity of sources reveals a town in which conviction, fear, envy, and opportunism mingled. Once the smoke cleared, public debate intensified far beyond Birmingham. Newspapers in London and provincial towns carried competing narratives. Political clubs and coffee houses became stages for arguments about constitutional order, toleration, and the proper reach of popular action. Parliament, too, registered concern. Some defenders of the rioters argued that law and custom had been threatened by men who celebrated the violence of the French Revolution, and that the populace was entitled to express its alarm. Others condemned the attacks as lawless and a breach of property and conscience. Questions were asked. Had the magistrates failed in their duty? Were the attacks spontaneous or organized? To what extent was local complicity present? Legal proceedings followed for some alleged rioters. Trials and depositions spread stories into the printed record. The courts, however, were not always neutral arenas. Local sympathies influenced outcomes. Some rioters were indicted, others escaped punishment. Many victims sought compensation, but found the legal recourse slow and inadequate. The press, partisan and proliferating, shaped public memory. Loyalist newspapers described the events as necessary purges of disloyalty. Radical and dissenting papers framed them as barbarism and persecution. Each side amplified evidence that supported its view, and each suppressed what did not. Beyond courts and pamphlets, the riot sparked debates about the nature of toleration, the proper relationship between church and state, and the limits of public protest. These intellectual debates were not abstract. They carried immediate consequences for livelihoods and social relations. These exchanges illustrate the underlying tension, whether liberty is absolute or qualified when set against what many perceived as social cohesion. Priestley's plea was for constitutional guarantees and the moral suasion of reason. His opponents invoked tradition, communal order, and the dangers of radical examples across borders. The debates extended to the role of the intellectual and the scientist in public life. Should men of letters and experiment engage in polemic? Might their authority in one field be misused in another? The Lunar Society's members had assumed they could move freely between conducting experiments and advocating for reform. The riots suggested otherwise. They showed that public prominence could attract public vengeance. Beyond the arguments and trials, the human cost was profound and dispersed. Families lost homes and possessions. Priests and ministers lost pulpits. Scientists lost instruments, and proprietors lost business. Some left town immediately, seeking refuge in more hospitable communities, or, like Joseph Priestley, emigrating abroad. Priestley's departure was symbolic. It signaled the loss of a particular hub of reformist energy. Yet dispersal did not extinguish the ideas that had animated the Lunar Society and other reformers. In new contexts, those ideas evolved, influenced debates in other countries, and continued to circulate among future generations. How have historians and contemporaries remembered the Birmingham Riots? The answer is complex. For some, they were an ugly episode of intolerance and mob violence. For others, they were an understandable expression of civic defense. Historiography has moved between these poles, interrogating sources, motives, and structures. Modern historians emphasize several overlapping causes: the cultural power of religious identity, the impact of revolutionary ideology, economic and social anxieties in a rapidly industrializing town, the failures or choices of local officials, and the volatile dynamics of rumor and communication. No single cause suffices. Rather, the riots emerge as the outcome of a confluence, structural pressures meeting contingent provocations. There is also an ethical dimension to memory. The victims of persecution, those whose houses were burned, whose libraries were destroyed, ask of us a duty to remember their losses not simply as material damage, but as assaults upon the capacity to think, teach, and testify. The Birmingham Riots did not overturn the British state. They did, however, reveal vulnerabilities. They exposed how local politics, religious divisions, and reactions to foreign events could conspire to terrorize a community. They raised questions about civil liberties, the enforcement of law, and the responsibilities of elites and officials. Across the 19th century, Britain would gradually expand political participation, reform institutions, and extend toleration. Those long, uneven processes were influenced by many forces, and the memory of episodes like Birmingham's riots contributed to the urgency among some advocates for stronger legal protections of conscience and expression. For historians and citizens alike, the lesson is not simply about a particular summer in a single town. It is about the fragility of civil society when rhetoric outruns restraint, when rumor replaces evidence, and when fear becomes a license for violence. It is about the responsibility of institutions to guard both order and liberty, and the duty of citizens to resist the temptation to settle political disputes with fire. More than 2 centuries after July 1791, Birmingham is a different city, yet the tensions that fanned flames there, between suspicion and curiosity, between authority and reform, between conformity and dissent, are perennial. The riots remind us that societies build their future by the choices they make in the present: how to respond to fear, how to adjudicate disagreement, and how to protect both the dignity of conscience and the stability of peace. This documentary has sought to reconstruct the events of those 4 fraught days and the debates that followed, to restore voices muffled by the blaze, and to consider the consequences of actions both immediate and long-term. The story of Birmingham is at once a local tragedy and a universal caution. If you have found this exploration illuminating, join us as we continue to revisit the moments where history was decided in smoke and speech. Subscribe for further documentaries that examine the intersections of ideas, conflict, and consequence.